All right, this is the Dunning-Kreuger effect, evidence for generalizability across demographics. The original study was performed by David Dunning and Justin Kreuger, and it was published in 1999. The research report was titled Unskilled and Unaware of It. But we took a bunch of white male Cornell students and asked them to take a series of tests based across humor, grammar, and logic that were synthesized from other national exams, such as the LSAT. And after they took these tests, they asked students to perform, or they asked students to estimate how many questions they think they had gotten correctly, and then where they ranked percentile-wise compared to their peers. And what they found is that those who were in the bottom quartile for their raw score consistently overestimated themselves, putting themselves above the 50th percentile when compared to their peers. And this is what we call the Dunning-Kreuger effect, when someone has a low skill level but overestimates their own ability. And they concluded that these people suffer from a dual burden of reaching erroneous choices, but also that their incompetence robs them of the metacognitive ability to realize it. As you can see from this graph, this area right here is what we're talking about. They have low scores, but they have very high self-estimations. They also found that those who perform in the top quartile significantly underestimate themselves by a good bit, but they didn't really have a solid conclusion for this, as this wasn't what they were intentionally looking for in their study. So my research question is, how does the Dunning-Kreuger effect affect different demographics? As the current literature does not have a lot of studies that have anyone other than college-age people, and especially the white male community, so trying to generalize that to a larger amount of demographics. So the first research report I'll be looking at is the Dunning-Kreuger effect in Emirati college students, evidence for generalizability across cultures, from Coutinho, Thomas, Frederick Lohman, and Verlinden Bunruck from Zayed University in the UAE. And all 30 students were female Emirati students, and they were given a matrix reasoning test on a laptop. So they were given 2 practice trials to get used to the system they were using, and then they were given 30 trials to go through and estimate how many they had gotten correct. And their results were almost identical to the original results from Dunning-Kreuger, so they found that it was somewhat generalizable to at least this population of female Emirati college students. The second one I'll be talking about is age-related reduction of the confidence-accuracy relationship in episodic memory, effects of recollection quality, and retrieval monitoring, from Wong, Kramer, and Gallo from the University of Chicago. So in this study, participants were either shown pictures that were in full color, black and white, and then fonts that were either in red or blue, and the pictures and fonts that were chosen were randomized to eliminate other confounding variables. And they concluded that there was a strong association between age-related impairment and declines in recollection confidence. And basically that means that older adults had a harder time being confident or getting things correct, and when they were correct, they were a lot less confident than their younger peers. Lastly, we've got adult age differences in the realism of confidence judgments, overconfidence, formal dependence, and cognitive predictors from Hansen, Roman, Jocelyn, and Goran Nielsen. And they had done previous work on meta-memory research, and so they had a large database of participants that they mailed a survey out to, and they had a list of 50 countries that they randomized for each survey participant and asked them to prepare a 80% confidence interval for the total country's population. For example, the United States, if the person was 80% sure that the real population of the United States was between 250 and 300 million people. And what their basic conclusion was is that lack of cognitive ability due to age can be somewhat compensated for due to greater knowledge or experience as you go on in your life. Now onto my method. I used an anonymous Google form, and I took 3 different tests. I had one in logic, one in grammar, and one in mathematics. The logic test was derived from the LSAT, similar to Dunning-Kreuger's original study and most of the other studies in this area. The grammar one was taken from the University of Oxford's grammar test, which again is pretty consistent throughout this area of research. And the mathematics test was taken from the Maine 2019 SAT, which was long enough ago where most of the students that had potentially taken that would be responding to this study wouldn't remember them, and any younger students wouldn't have taken this test. So this was deemed a valid source of test questions. And after each set of questions, so there were 10 for each test, each participant was asked to estimate how many of them they believed they got correct. And at the end of the study, they were asked for their demographics, so their religion, their race, and their age, and political leanings. And so to get results for this, I would graph, like in the graph from the original study, their real value versus their expected value, and then take the difference between each value and kind of compare them across demographics. So here are my results. Like I said, what I'm doing is I'm taking this expected value, subtracting it from their real test score, and then getting what I call the Q-score in this research study. A positive Q-score would indicate that they were overconfident, a negative Q-score would be that they were underconfident. And they could get 30 total points because there were 3 tests and 10 questions. So for the total Q-score for all participants across all 3 tests, the bottom half was 3.6875, while the bottom quartile was 4.125. Now for racial differences, the 2 biggest groups that I got were white participants and Asian participants. So for white participants, the bottom half Q-score was 3.33, while the quartile was 3.833. And for Asian participants, the bottom half Q-score was negative 0.33, and the bottom quartile was negative 0.5. Now the 3 biggest age groups I got were 16, 17, and 18-year-olds. So the Q-score for the bottom half of 16-year-olds was 1.25, and for the bottom quartile of 16-year-olds, it was 4.5. For 17-year-olds, the bottom half Q-score was 7.83, and the bottom quartile score was 10.67. For 18-year-olds, the bottom half Q-score was 2, and the bottom quartile score was 2.5. So, because this is a Dunning-Kreuger effect research study, we first have to prove that we actually found the Dunning-Kreuger effect before we can look into the differences between demographics. And although the total results that I got in this study were not quite as pronounced as some of the other studies, the bottom quartile did overestimate themselves by at least 25%, putting them above average, which is conclusive evidence for findings of the Dunning-Kreuger effect. So from here we can proceed into some more analysis of my actual data. So we're going to begin with age because it's a little bit easier to talk about. Just going off of biological and logical factors, you would think that the younger you are, the more miscalibrated you're going to be in your judgments of your own ability. This is due to your prefrontal cortex not being as developed, and also the fact that you have lower life experience in general, so you don't really have a good sense of how you're going to react to every scenario. But fascinatingly enough, the 17-year-olds were wildly above average for the total Q-score, while the 16-year-olds were only a little bit above, and the 18-year-olds were a little bit below. Now, the 16-year-olds being above definitely makes sense because they're the youngest population I had a significant amount of data for, and therefore you would kind of assume that they're going to be overestimating themselves, while the 18-year-olds were the largest big group of older participants in the study, so they would probably be a little more calibrated. Now, the 17-year-olds were wildly miscalibrated, much more than either one of these groups. And this is interesting because there are a few different reasons that we could pull up for this. And it's also interesting because the 17-year-olds had the largest sample size, and there were no obvious outliers. So it should be the one that's the most statistically sound internally. This could potentially be because 17-year-olds would likely be juniors in high school at this point, and COVID-19 struck them while they were ending 8th grade and going into their freshman year of high school. And this may have led them to believe that they had a higher ability, higher base foundation in their academic skills when they actually do not, because their education may have suffered a little bit during this time due to factors that were outside of their control. Now moving on to the racial differences, as you may have seen in the original graph, 57% of all Asian respondents underestimated themselves. Now this may lead some people to say, well, obviously these people did not suffer from the Dunning-Kreuger effect, but I do not think that is the case, because if they truly did not suffer from the Dunning-Kreuger effect, then there would have been a random amount of up and down, overestimated and underestimated. Whereas with them, it was pretty significant underestimating, and if they were overestimating themselves, it was not by a lot. And this leads us to believe that there's got to be something else here. Now, I looked through all of the other things that could have had a potential impact on this. Their age wasn't a significant factor. Their religion wasn't a significant factor. The only thing that possibly could have affected it was that the Asian participants were slightly more left-leaning in total, but I do not believe that this had a significant factor. Most likely, this is due to cultural differences. It's possible that the Asian participants were raised in cultures that have more emphasis on humility, so perhaps that's why they didn't estimate their ability as being higher. And this also could have been because Asian culture may have more emphasis on academic prowess, and they're always used to being compared to higher levels, and they're kind of just used to not being at that higher level of academic prowess. These are possible explanations, but it's hard to tell for certain without further research into this area. Now lastly, we have the burden of expertise, which I think is one of the more fascinating parts of my research study specifically. And this is what I briefly mentioned earlier with Dunning-Kreuger. They found that the people who had the highest skill levels often underestimated themselves. And their psychological reasoning for this is what they deemed the false consensus effect, which in essence is that if someone takes a test and gets a very high score on it, it was probably very easy for them. And they would assume that everyone else had the same level of ease that they had, and so they don't think that they're that special, when in fact they actually are much better than some of their peers. Now this makes sense for Dunning-Kreuger's original study and other ones that were like it that compared themselves to peers. However, mine was an anonymous Google form, and this means that there was no relation to their peers. There's no judgment in that sense, and so there was no way that they could have suffered from this false consensus effect because they were just doing it by themselves. So I think this is one of the more interesting findings, and more research should definitely be done as to why this happens. With any good research, obviously there's going to be a lot of limitations. My biggest limitation was sample size. I sent it out to a large amount of people, but the actual amount that responded to my survey was very low. Now there are a few different reasons that this could have happened. Firstly, I tried to structure my survey in a way where it started with the hardest questions first and then slowly got easier to avoid survey fatigue. This possibly could have meant that a lot of people went into my survey, saw that the first few questions were very difficult and assumed that the entire survey was going to be in this way, and then decided to quit halfway through. Or some people may have just seen that I put 30 to 45 minutes as the estimated time and just decided, I don't want to do this at all, which is definitely possible. The amount that we can attribute to either one of these is hard to tell, but getting a larger sample size would have been a lot better and make the data a little bit more statistically significant. Secondly, survey fatigue in general. Like I said, I structured my survey in a way to try to avoid that, but some people are going to get survey fatigue, especially since it's a 30 to 45 minute survey, and I would expect that most people are going to hit survey fatigue around 12 to 15 minutes, so it's hard to tell. And then lastly, a big criticism of the Dunning-Kreuger effect and research about it in general is that it assumes that knowledge of the domain directly correlates with ability in the domain. And so what this means is that I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room that have a high knowledge of basketball. They know how to shoot the ball, they know how to dribble, pass, all the plays, right? But no one in here is going to be able to beat LeBron James or Michael Jordan in a 1v1. It's just not going to happen. Your skill and knowledge of the sport are not the same as your athletic prowess in it. However, for the domains that I chose, which was mathematics, logic, and grammar, those two are directly correlated. If you are good at math, you are inherently a skilled mathematician. If you are good at grammar, you're going to be an inherently skilled linguist, and so on. So in these domains, knowledge of the domain will directly correlate with ability of the domain. So that is not a significant limitation of this study. So in relation to other work on overconfidence, from Ross 1990, Vallone 1990, and Phillips 1982, they did very similar research, and they found that predictions before testing far exceeded accuracy rates, which is a little bit different than mine because they had their predictions before the testing, whereas mine was after the testing, but they also found in that case that people significantly overestimate themselves. Another significant finding from their studies is that there's often more miscalibration when the task is deemed more difficult, which I kind of found in mine because the logic section was definitely the hardest with the lowest raw scores in total, and that's when people were the most miscalibrated. The math section was probably the more intermediate one, and people were very calibrated there. That could have been due to familiarity with the SAT math sort of questions. That's hard to tell exactly. And then the grammar section, most people scored 8s, 9s, or 10s, which could have led them to question themselves as to scoring so high. So that was also one that had more miscalibration than I would have expected, even though it seemed to be the easiest one in general. So there definitely should be more research in this area, specifically on the areas that I mentioned, the differences between Asian and white participants, and the difference between 16, 17, and 18-year-olds. And here are my works cited pages.
Terrific, thanks Jackson. I have a few questions for you, and then we'll wrap this up. So the first question is, how did you determine which results that were generated by your process were important to put in front of us?
So mostly it was dependent on which groups had the largest amount of survey participants, because I did have a small sample size, so the ones that had more participants were going to be more statistically significant. On top of that, specifically the 17-year-olds because they were so miscalibrated, and then the Asian participants because they were the only group across any demographic that significantly underestimated themselves.
Terrific. And then as a follow-up, you talked a little bit about this right at the end, but I want to give you a chance to expand upon it. How do your research findings provide directions for future research in this field?
Yes, so definitely there's been, like I mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of research in this area, but it's mostly college level students. And my research started to kind of dig more into high school age students, but there definitely needs to be more in this realm, especially considering that the brain is mostly developing until you hit around that college age. And so the differences between like prefrontal cortex size and development in regards to overestimation of one's own ability should definitely be researched further.
Terrific. And then the final question, think all the way back to the initial curiosity that started you down this road. Are there other curiosities, and what might you have done with those in developing a research project?
So I was probably going to do something with psychology in general. I was really fascinated by the Dunning-Kreuger effect, but I also considered doing something in sports psychology. I think the big one for me, because I'm a soccer player, I would have done psychology of taking penalty kicks, because those are very high pressure scenarios. And there's some professional players that seem to be incredibly good at it, who very rarely miss, and some that are absolutely horrible at taking penalty kicks. And so researching the different psychological effects, like maybe looking at the amount of sweat they had, or their blood pressure, any biological effects that also could have played into their physiological or their psychological state before penalty kick, I think that would have also been pretty interesting to research.
Terrific. Thanks, Jackson.